Let's talk a little bit about clickbait. You're going to see these really inflammatory terms being used. Numbers without context is nothing.
Their MO often is to boost revenue, things like chaos, plunge, plummet.
This headline's not interesting to read. We're making a podcast. It was boring enough to you that you didn't want to read it.
Great
this
point.
is a perfect example of
boring. But
yeah. We're in a very significant wave of anti-Boeing sentiment. The natural and right thing to do is just let go of everything. So Christian, today we're going to talk a little bit about the fear mongering that we've talked about a lot with specifically the story collector, the people who are most dramatically impacted by news articles and things of that nature that come out with topics like flight plunges 26,000 feet, which we are going to talk about here in just a few minutes. But before we do that, you just had a really interesting weekend and I want to hear about it. You went to a friend of ours' bachelor party and it was not your typical bachelor party. I understand it was space camp. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we went to space camp. So one of the best friends from growing up actually learned how to fly with Justin back in 8th grade. Back in 8th grade, met each other at the local airport. Big space enthusiast and interested in just rockets. Big NASA fan. So we had his bachelor party this last weekend. Took the boy to Cape Canaveral, to the Kennedy Space Center. While we were there, had an awesome experience, saw 2 SpaceX Starlink launches, one on Thursday night, one on Saturday night. And then another friend of ours works at Blue Origin. And so we got a tour of their vehicle assembly building, also did the NASA Kennedy Space Center tour. So big space camp weekend. And I learned a lot. I was just amazed at the progress of commercial space travel, exploration, where things are headed. It makes me think a lot about commercial aviation and its early beginning pioneering days, because frankly, I think we're watching that as a sideline to the space industry is kind of having this second coming after its, dominance in the 60s, 70s, and then through the shuttle missions in the late 90s, early 2000s. And now we're kind of in this next generation and revolution of space. And so it was very eye-opening and intriguing experience, thinking that maybe someday in the future there's a dial-up pilot for space flight, which I think you and I are certainly not qualified for. We'll turn it over to the NASA guys or a couple of retired astronauts, dial an astronaut or something. But yeah, it's really interesting on what's going on down there in Florida and I'm sure in Texas, California, with your familiarity with Hawthorne. So yeah, it was a really unique and interesting couple days.
Yeah, it is fascinating. As far as the space launch stuff goes, I was just listening to another podcast about this, and the point that was made was effectively that in order to put, obviously artificial intelligence is a huge thing going on right now, and in order to put data centers in space, the number was something along the lines of 2 or 3 launches per day to get data centers online in space, because there's all these different great aspects of cooling up there that we just can't provide here in the United States or down here on Earth, and energy needs and all that stuff. And that's way outside the scope of this podcast, but it was really fascinating to listen to. And one of the things that Christian, you and I kind of brought up was that number is unfathomable to us today. 3 launches a day. I mean, those numbers are crazy, but now we have reusable rockets. We have all these things that are allowing us to actually go to space in a much more reliable cadence. And airliners and aviation was like that back in the early days of aviation. Aviation first came around in 1903. I've been listening to this book about Chester Nimitz, who was the essentially the leader of the United States Navy in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He was on multiple airplane accidents. He just kind of kept crashing. And at some point I was like, how would this guy just keep getting in an airplane? And he was a really important player. And that was just kind of how it was back in the 40s. And, nowadays, obviously, we've talked a lot about how much safety we enjoy in modern aviation and how those things that were happening back then, this book I'm listening to, I'm like, that is just unbelievable to me. Because, I don't research the aviation history from the perspective of individual crashes. I kind of learn about it from these were the big leaps that we took as far as technology goes and things like that. but then to hear this biography of an individual in a wartime theater, it was just incredible. And they literally viewed aircraft at that time as expendable. And the pilots were not expendable. That was what they were like. We need to go rescue them whenever they're downed, but we have enough production. It's fine. Just keep more airplanes coming out to the carriers. So a very interesting adjacent from aviation that was really only 80 years ago. And I think, as you said, we're seeing that revolution in space right now. So I was very envious of that trip. It sounded awesome. You were sending me photos of it. And I'm like, man, this looks cool.
Yeah, it's cool to watch the pioneering days of something like that. Like you're saying, it's like getting a lens of commercial aviation back in the 1920s or the 1930s, like when a trimotor would take off. A lot of people, I'm sure, would stop and watch because that wasn't something you saw every day. And that's how it was for space launches back in, the times of the Saturn, rockets and the Apollo program. It was like we were seeing pictures at the Kennedy Space Center of the just roads, bumper to bumper, the beaches lined with people. And then when we watched the SpaceX Starlink launch on Saturday night, there was 10, 15 cars. It's turned into business as usual. So, and I'm sure that's how it was for commercial aviation 20 years after the trimotor and, the Boeing 247, those famous early day airliners that, eventually you get to the 50s. It's like, oh yeah, there's another commercial airplane. And we're going to see that same thing with space. That cadence of a couple a day is going to absolutely happen. It's amazing. We saw that SpaceX booster, the first stage that comes back and lands in the drone ship. Thursday night's launch that we watched, it landed off the shore of the Bahamas. And Sunday, when we left Cape Canaveral to go to the airport, we left the port area, and it was sitting on that drone ship getting offloaded back onto shore. And so, a matter of Thursday night, it landed on a drone ship, and Sunday it's back to the Kennedy Space Center to get primed up and head out again. And just
that's crazy.
Think of the turnaround time on something like that. Like routine flight is coming in that world just like it did in commercial aviation. So yeah, just a cool experience and a good parallel to watch another industry kind of pioneer and dawn itself here, from a new, angle. Obviously space flight's been around for a while, but just particularly from like routine commercial space flight, that's not been a thing in our history. So yeah, good times.
Totally. Yeah. One of the things we talk about with spaceflight a lot is like going to Mars, but I think it's really amazing once you realize like, oh, we're doing these launches as an amazing cadence just to launch small satellites and Starlink and things of that nature. So yeah, awesome trip. With that being said though, let's talk a little bit about the clickbait. And let's actually break some articles down, and we'll have you read those articles to us, and then I'll kind of provide some technical analysis of it. The common string amongst all of these is you're going to see these really inflammatory terms being used in all of these articles. And then when we actually take a look at them a little bit more in depth, it's going to allow us to see that this wasn't business as usual, of course, because anytime there's an aircraft incident or something happens on board, that's not business as usual, because we do enjoy such an incredible level of safety and redundancy and all those things that, 99 point however many % of flights just go off without a hitch, and there's absolutely nothing newsworthy. But when there is something newsworthy, even though the airplane landed perfectly safe, in most of the cases we're going to talk about today, they can put this inflammatory verbiage in there. We are going to talk about at the very end, the Air India accident, and we're not going to break down the accident itself, but we are going to talk about a theory that went viral online that I believe the Air India investigators had to actually come out and say, no, that's a myth. But we're going to talk about how that all came together. So just a forewarning on that. We are going to talk about that. But yeah, Christian, you want to start us off? I think it was a Japan Airlines flight that was the first one that caught our eye.
Yeah, an interesting article about an aircraft plunging and plummeting out of the sky. I think too, before maybe we dive into a couple of these case studies, it's important to just unbox why clickbait exists. And I think about just the general social media, legacy media, TV, whatever it may be. Their MO often is to boost revenue, boost, the virality of something, because that's a reward in revenue. And I think for them, that is the secret sauce that they're always working on refining and trying to make better. I think the unfortunate reality for our industry in the aviation space is that the victim or the byproduct is people really suffer, as we saw in our last podcast episode when we broke down the story collector of our 5 nervous flyer types. We saw such a big number in the story collector space because the media has gotten very good at their jobs by focusing on verbs like plunging and plummeting, like we're going to look at here in this first article in a couple seconds, instead of saying things like that are technically much more controlling to a situation that you and I would be familiar, like a controlled descent or a normal descent rate in a lot of these cases. But it's just easy for them to rip up a verb like plunge or plummet because that drives ad revenue, it drives virality, it's attention seeking, and it often is only for that 1 to 2 minute range where we're trying to grab someone's attention for 2 minutes, drive that click count up. And in reality, aviation takes so long to analyze and think about these things. So it's the exact opposite of what we're used to in the aviation space, which is take a long, thorough time to investigate, but instead we're going to slap a couple crazy verbs like plunge and plummet to grab someone's attention, make them nervous about flying, move on to the next article. And so it's an unfortunate, kind of result from that, years of effort to really grab people's attention. So big part of why this is such a big crusade to me personally is this is an easy thing for us to dispel. It's, you and I look at these articles and we go, that's not at all what the reality is. But for, an average nervous flyer or an average person of the public, they won't know that. And so that's a big reason why Kyle and I felt that it's, we feel it's so important to, run through some of these and break them down. So let's get into them. So check out a couple of these case studies. So first one we're going to look at is from a pretty major media outlet, not a respect. We'll keep the names kind of private here, but the headline specifically says flight turns chaotic after 26,000 foot plunge triggers mass deployment. A Japan Airlines flight plunged nearly 26,000 feet in minutes, leaving passengers gasping for air and fearing the worst. What a headline, huh?
Quite the headline. I believe that the article then goes on to say as well that people were writing their wills and sending final messages. Am I right in my understanding of that one?
The twin to this article was a YouTube video that had something in the headlines along the line of, people start writing their final goodbyes in their will. It's like, wow. And then, we go on in this article to read a Japan Airlines flight turned into a nightmare on June 30th after a Boeing 737 plunged 26,000 feet in just 10 minutes, forcing passengers to grab oxygen mask and brace for the worst. And you and I look at something on, a 26,000 foot descent in 10 minutes and think, what do we think, airline captain?
Yeah, normal. Here's the thing. Numbers without context is nothing. There's no value to having any number if you don't understand what it actually means. And so for me, seeing a 26, so let's explain the math here real quick. 26,000 feet divided by 10 minutes. That means that we descended 2,600 feet per minute. What I want you to know about this is that's a normal descent rate. 2,600 feet per minute is a normal descent rate. There's a couple of different ways that we can descend the airplane, Christian, and one of them is through what we call the vertical navigation. And that is basically the airplane calculates an ideal path. We turn it on vertical navigation, and it'll just manage it to hit all of these points essentially without leveling off. It depends on the programming of the airplane. But the most efficient way that we can descend is fly all the way to the closest point that we can to the airport, pull the power all the way to idle, and just idle descent all the way down. That's the most fuel efficient way we can do that. One of the modes that we can use for that is what's called level change. In a Boeing product, in an Airbus product, it's called open descent. And the idea that takes is exactly what I just described, which is the engine thrust comes all the way back to idle. And all you do is you use gravity to just let the airplane start descending. And you're just adjusting the pitch of the airplane. So, how high or how low the nose is to maintain an airspeed. So we're now exchanging our altitude for airspeed. And a 2,600 foot per minute descent rate with idle thrust is very normal. And in fact, may even be slow depending on some other factors, how heavy the aircraft is, different things that outside the scope of this conversation. But 2,600 feet to me is like, okay, that's normal. I mean, depending on how smooth it is, we may have the seatbelt sign off for a 2,600 foot per minute descent rate. I will say that it may feel a little bit steep when you first start coming down the hill, because you usually will kind of pitch over to like 1,500 feet a minute, get into like 2,200 feet a minute. It all just depends. A lot of this depends on how strong the tailwinds are and things of that nature as you're working your way into an airport. So, it talks about the mass deploying. Now, in the article that I read, there were some key things that were included there that talked about there was a loud noise heard, and then suddenly the masks deployed. Now let's talk about that mask system. Sorry, go ahead, Christian.
I'll quote that part specifically because I was actually going to bring this up after you had finished your thought. It says, this is a quote from a passenger. I'm going to bring up a point after you talk about the mask here. It says, I heard a muffled boom and the oxygen mask fell off in a few seconds, one passenger told the Associated Press, not the one that wrote the article. The stewardess cried and shouted to put on an oxygen mask, saying the plane had a malfunction. So the boom to oxygen mask is a direct quote out of the article, and just an interesting eyewitness account there. But go ahead and continue your explanation on the mask.
Totally. Okay, so to understand why the mask deploy, we first need to understand what's happening in the airplane. And when we're flying up at these high altitudes, and I'm going to assume that they ultimately descended to 10,000 feet above the ground, or above sea level.
About 10,500. They started at 36,000. That's where the 26,000 foot descent came from.
Perfect. Okay, so you're at 36,000 feet. Well, we can't breathe the air normally at 36,000 feet. It's just, there's not enough oxygen in it. So what we do is we take air that comes into the engines, we essentially compress that, we put it through what's called a pressurization and air conditioning system, a pack, and then that goes into the airplane and it pumps that pressure into the airplane, it air conditions it, and it makes it breathable oxygen for us. That's why we don't have to be on oxygen when we're in the airplane. This is all automatically controlled by a series of what we call outflow valves and all these things. Again, at the risk of getting too technical, I just want you to know this system is all automated and there's multiple redundancies to it. Now, there could theoretically be something that happens where inability to control the amount of air leaving that tube is coming from, an inability to control it becomes a problem, because then we can't pump enough air in to actually sustain that pressurization. So to give you one more kind of image of how this system works, you pump the air in. Well, you can't over pump air in because that causes other problems. So there's these valves that are called outflow valves that let air out. Now, we need that air to go out at a specific rate. So if that system becomes imbalanced, then we can get into a situation where we cannot, what we call, control the cabin pressure. And that would be a depressurization. So again, some technical terms here. But what this sounds like to me is they had a depressurization. That's factual. They certainly had a depressurization. Whether it was an outflow valve sticking or something else, I'm not sure, of course. But you hear him say, a few seconds later, the masks deploy. Well, how do the masks deploy? There's a pressure system inside of the airplane that will actually manage the cabin pressure. And so when it detects that the cabin altitude, so how high what it feels like for us inside of the airplane goes, once it hits 14,000 feet, those masks will automatically deploy. So it sends a signal, the masks automatically drop, you pull those masks down, it starts the flow of oxygen. And all we're going to do at that point is we're just keeping everybody's consciousness, and we'll descend down to 10,000 feet. And at 10,000 feet, you would be able to take your mask off and you can breathe totally normal. Like, Christian, when we're flying around in the little airplanes that don't have pressurization, we can breathe normal all the way up to 12,500 feet. If we're there for 30 minutes or longer, then we need to put oxygen on. If we go up to 14,000 feet for any period of time, we need to have oxygen on. But this is just to prove, to say, yeah, there was an issue on the airplane. The masks deployed like they're supposed to. They did a normal descent rate down to 10,000 feet and handled this perfectly. The flight attendants in that case, they are trained to tell you to put your mask on first before helping others. It sounds like the flight attendant did exactly what he or she was supposed to do, making the announcements. And you have to be very forceful about those things. People are going to be looking around, confused, panicked, wondering what's going on. You have to be very forceful in how you handle those things. So shrieking, crying, those descriptors to me are probably inaccurate. These flight attendants are very professional at what they do. They're very convincing when they start going in on the training that they have. Like, I've watched them do evacuation practices, and it's like I feel like I need to whip into shape. It's like being with a drill instructor. I mean, they go into work mode, and it's really impressive. So I'm not surprised by any of those things, but I just want to say, when I read an article like that, I'm like, everything went perfectly. There was a system issue. They handled it perfectly. There's nothing to see here. Christian, what do you got?
Yeah, and I think it's just as a perfect encapsulation of using crazy verbs to inflate a very normal trained force situation in the aviation space. And the next paragraph down from what I quoted recently says, one rider gripped by panic said that they wrote out their will mid-flight, including insurance details and PIN numbers. So there's a little elaboration from the headline of the YouTube video we found when we were doing some research for this. A couple points that I want to bring up about these. Number one, I think, eyewitness emotion does not equal a technical assessment, right? You have passengers that just came out of a very, fight or flight situation. Their, amygdala's all popped up. That's the one that accounts for survivability. They're in this flare, meaning you have removed all of your logical brain up front and you're only in the back of your brain, which is just trying to keep you alive. So it's very emotional heavy and not very technical heavy. And so when a reporter gets to somebody in that state and asks them to talk about their experience, that's when they're going to get these crazy, headlines that says, let me read it again just to make sure I give it specific. Plunged 26,000 feet, leaving passengers grasping for air and fearing the worst. That's how you end up with a headline like that. And that's all driven from these emotional eyewitness accounts. Not saying that the emotional response is wrong. It just might not be the best person to speak to about that incident. Maybe a trained professional or someone like Captain Kyle, who can talk a little bit about 26,000 foot normal descent, right? So that's one.
But the other point I really want to...
Like
math, we don't know. To get math out of here. We don't want math right now.
Yeah, right. The other one is just like, I kind of brought this point up earlier, but just to kind of, hash out again is this fear language for verbs to drive clicks, right? It's things like chaos, plunge, plummet. And what we could have used is a normal descent or a controlled descent or something like that. But you and I both know that's not going to get clicks. It's not going to drive ad revenue. It's not going to do all of the things that the large media conglomerates are out to do. And so that's how we end up in this, people fearing from their lives turns into just another day on the job working through an aircraft issue, small one, albeit. And, as we always go back to often, aviation being the safest mode of transportation in human history didn't just happen. It's very intentional. It's by people like Kyle training, very adamantly, day in and day out. And, like you had brought up the point about flight attendants that get that practice in an aftermath just in case it ever happens. Those things are all very intentional and calculated and quite the opposite of what we're finding from articles like this.
Yeah. We actually had a dial-a-pilot call client. This was maybe 2 years ago now, that did a call with us beforehand and then sent me an email afterwards and said, hey, we actually had a depressurization on my flight and the oxygen mask deployed and we returned to Atlanta. It was a flight from Atlanta to Eagle, Colorado. And I was like, oh my gosh, do you need to debrief? Like, I can call you right now. What do we need to do? And she was like, no, I'm good. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. It was amazing to me that like she had one call and was ready to go and had gone through this depressurization and was fine. I mean, major kudos to her. But I very, very clearly remember getting that email and I'm like, whoa, I've never had a depressurization, but I would imagine if you're a nervous flyer and like on edge going into it, it would really kind of give you some anxiety to experience. Although, now, what happens in those cases and you're going to be just fine. But yeah, things like this do happen occasionally. And most of the time it's just a non-event that you return to the airport, they get you on a new airplane and they get you to Eagle a couple hours later.
Yeah. Right. Cool. Let's move on to the next one. This one more of a major tabloid framing a minor incident at an airport. So I'll read the headline out of this big tabloid. It says, passenger claims part of plane, quote, fell off after two airliners collide at a Texas airport. The incident occurred Tuesday, November 18th at a Houston airport. It was two airliners that made contact on the ramp area. So during the pushback phase of the flight, one taxiing by, small incident that one clipped the other, basically. And then our headline from this major tabloid, I'm going to read back to translation. Passenger claims part of airplane, quote, fell off after two airliners collide. So, just like we saw in the debrief and the debunking of this, 26,000 foot plummet or plunge, let's look into some of the technical details of something like these two aircraft making contact on the ramp area.
Totally. So first and foremost, let me just acknowledge this. you don't want any airplanes to collide on the ramp area. That's obviously not a good thing. We try to avoid that as much as we possibly can. But as it relates to a part falling off, if an airplane is taxiing and it runs its wing or its tail into something else, well, of course, that you've got these large metal structures, something has to give at that point. Now, I don't know what part of the aircraft this individual was talking about. I don't know if it was a ceiling panel that fell down. That's a plastic panel that just it's not there for anything other than to just make the inside of the airplane look nice and hide wiring and things of that nature. If something like that falls down, that's an easy fix. You just pop it right back up there. But right. It's interesting to see that, because in a case like this, that article does go on to say everybody was fine. The aircraft go back to the gate. They end up rebooking everybody and send them out a little bit late. Now, of course, we don't want these things to happen. And the airlines put a lot of effort into making sure that ground collisions don't happen. Uncommanded aircraft movements don't happen. We have all of these different call-outs that we make when we're taxiing, clear left, clear ahead, clear right, things like that, just to make sure that, hey, we're seeing everything that we need to see here. But unfortunately, the nature of just these huge numbers that we operate, at some point, these little fender bender type of incidents, may happen. But this would be akin to, in my mind, something like a headline, of glass explodes and violent collision on Interstate 80. And it's like somebody rear-ended somebody at 10 miles an hour and the back glass broke out. Like, right. Okay, yeah, it's not good. But, you can make an article very inflammatory very, very quickly. So, Christian, anything to add on that?
No, that's a great point. The only thing I will add is just another one of those, to bring back to the point I was making on the last article, just eyewitness accounts getting a little inflammatory yet again. It says, quote, "It felt like we had run over something heavy. That's what it felt like. All of us in the back of the plane were like, oh, what was that?" She says, goes on to continue the quote a little bit further. It says, "The lady behind me was like, did you see that? A piece of the plane fell off." And so that's where the headline comes from. So you have, again, an eyewitness, interview after the incident happens, on what I'm going to assume are some non-technical aviation personnel. And then that gets slapped on the headline of a major tabloid, because then they can run a headline that says, "Passenger claims part of plane, quote, fell off after two airliners collided at Texas airport." And so, small fender bender, ground contact, no injuries, no issues. We get the planes buttoned back up, much later on in maintenance, but they rebook people on airplanes that are ready to go, and everybody continues on. But yet, a nervous flyer comes across something like this, and just think back to the two headlines we've read already. Aircraft plunges or plummets 26,000 feet, over 10 minutes. And then, part of a plane, quote, fell off. Airplane parts don't fall off, right? And in this case, you have a small contact or a collision, and a piece of damaged debris does potentially fall off. But the headline claims that parts of the plane just, quote, fell off. And to me, it just kind of makes me chuckle, because it's like, I've done a lot of flying in my life, haven't quite particularly watched things just fall off. It sounds catastrophic, when in reality it's a fender bender. If you have a fender bender in your car and something falls off, it's like, yeah, well, we just had a fender bender. It makes sense.
Right.
So putting passenger quotes in the headline immediately following anything that's not routine or normal can make for some interesting speculation, when in reality, like you were saying, it's probably like a fairing or a winglet or a panel or something like that.
It's interesting you say that, because even my own experience in this, I hear that and I'm like, okay, it was probably one of these small things, that like you said, you take into maintenance and they fix the airplane up, and that takes a few days for them to do that. They're obviously not going to put this airplane back into service until everything's buttoned up and it's airworthy and good to go and all these sign-offs happen. But the nervous flyer may think, oh, the engine fell off. But again, Let's use the metaphor of a fender bender. Like, you get in a fender bender in your Honda Accord, the engine doesn't just fall out of, the forward compartment there. So, it's just verbiage that can be inflammatory in nature. So let's move on to the next one.
Next article. So this one, we wanted to look a little bit into the aftermath of an accident. So an actual, full blown accident. This was one of the unfortunate situations out of India, the Air India accident in 2025 with the Boeing 787. So the interesting part about this article, it's an article actually debunking and fact checking social media, basically the social media virality after this accident. So what basically happens here is the headline's not as interesting to read, so I won't necessarily read it word for word, but the prelim report for that Air India accident had not come out yet. And there was a huge viral claim online that a pilot seat faulty, some faulty mechanism in the pilot seat drove this accident to happening. And this kind of raged social media after the accident. And this report comes out to say that the investigators and the folks that were responsible for reporting on this crash, not news or media agencies, the actual investigative community in India, had to come out and dispel this because they were like, this is not anywhere near the cause of this accident. This was, moments later. This is not something that's a part of our official investigation. And for me, the frustrating part is now you have active investigators who are working on getting the solution to this incident, and yet they're being sidetracked because social media has just run rampant and just driven this narrative that a pilot seat, caused this accident. The more you look into it a little bit further, you see a LATAM incident
hang on.
Oh, you got to jump in.
Yeah. Read through this real quick and just give me the narrative that they actually came up with. And I also want to point out one thing. You said this headline's not interesting to read. Does that not encapsulate exactly what we're talking about? We're making a podcast about that. It was boring enough to you that you didn't want to read it.
That's fair.
Imagine to everybody in the world, right? Like that's
right. Yeah, great
this
point.
is a perfect example of it's just not fun to read. Let's just move on to the next one.
Well, okay. Now I have to read it. It says no mention of faulty. No mention of faulty pilot seat in Air India prelim report. Boring. But great.
Yeah. Right.
But
for us, it's like, oh, okay. So, okay, now read through here and tell me what it says, Christian, as far as like what their narrative was. I think it was like the captain's seat moved back and he pulled the thrust levers back. Read through it real quick, and I'm going to just debunk immediately why that wouldn't happen anyways. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the excerpt says, quote, social media post 4 days later, and this is 4 days after the accident that occurred on June 12th to 25, 4 days later claimed a preliminary report by India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, to be similar to our NTSB, had determined, quote, the root cause of the crash to be the captain's seat in the cockpit. It couldn't stay locked in place, one of the posts said. It suddenly slid backwards and caused the captain to pull the controls back to idle. And they're referring to the throttles in this case. But this was not India's investigation board. This was social media post claiming that the India Investigation Bureau had made this claim or narrative in a prelim report 4 days after the accident. There's no prelim report that comes out 4 days after an accident, right? So there's our first debunk, but go on to talk about the technical details about, this pilot seat and why that wouldn't happen.
Yeah. One of the funny things that I noticed in the verbiage of that article when I read it this morning was it said something along the lines of like Air India accident report finally out. And it's like, it's been 4 days. It's not finally out. They're just starting this process. And so anytime you see any of that stuff, like in the immediate aftermath of an accident, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, you just got to be patient. That's really what it boils down to. But here's exactly what I hear in that. In that process, they go on to say the captain's seat moved aft and he was not able to hang on to the controls and therefore pulled the thrust levers or the throttles back to idle, reducing power on the airplane and therefore stalling the airplane. Here's the thing about the Boeing 787. It's a nice airplane. It's got really good technology in it. I fly an airplane from the 1990s that was the original one that has this technology called fly-by-wire in an airliner. And fly-by-wire, it's this really cool system where when you point the airplane in a specific direction and let go of the controls, it stays there. So if I bring the nose up to 10 degrees nose up and I turn the wings 5 degrees banked left and I let go, it stays there. That's it. So if something like this were to truly happen, because it's not unfeasible that a seat moves. And in fact, we're actually going to talk about a seat that did actually move and was the root cause of a problem, but that was not the case in this one. It's not unfeasible for a seat to move. If a seat were to move, though, especially on a Boeing 787 or anything with fly-by-wire, the natural and right thing to do is just let go of everything. the airplane's going to keep going where it's going. The thrust is on. The flight directors are telling you where you need to go. I mean, you have all of these different things programmed into the airplane where all pilots would do this, where they would just let go. On an airliner, it makes perfect sense. You just let it go. Hey, yep, it's good. Hey, there's someone sitting next to you in the other seat, and their seat didn't move. You got the aircraft. I got the aircraft. Slide your seat forward. It's got an electrical motor on it. You come back up after 5 seconds. And you're like, all right, I got the airplane back. And you're good. There's no accident that happens there. Like that is just such an unreasonable thing to think that would cause an accident. The other pilot, let's say that, okay, somehow the captain makes a mistake where they actually bring the thrust levers back to idle. The other pilot is going to be sitting in their normal control station and goes, I have the aircraft, thrust levers back to full, continue flying the airplane. It's not like that's a non-event. I mean, it would be exciting in a not good way, but that's not something that's going to cause an aircraft accident like that. So just seeing things like that is crazy. But the whole purpose of talking about this, Christian, is really to say that theory went crazy viral in such a manner that the investigative board in India had to come out and say, that's wrong. That's not true. Right. That's actually not what happened. And they didn't even know yet. So,
and what a waste of resources, right? It's unfortunate. They're busy doing their job, trying to get to the root cause of the actual real root cause. And it goes on to say in this article, India's Press Information Bureau said in a June 21st, so a couple days after the accident, that social media claims about the prelim report were fake. They did release a prelim report, many days later, and it had, almost over a month later. Here it says it does not establish a root cause, nor does it reference a malfunction in any of the pilot seats. So, you and I have talked about this a number of times in the aftermath of an accident. Take pause, wait. We just reviewed the Washington, D.C. Report that finally is getting closer to its formal official release, and we're, well over a year, waiting for that. So it's, like we had talked about a little bit earlier, and one of the points I definitely will bring up again when we, in closing, media drives on cycles of minutes and hours and days, and investigators and the aviation safety world works on courses of months and sometimes years to come to the root cause of things. So your immediate red flag should be when you see something like this, take pause to say, hey, we've been 4 days. They won't have anything formal at this point, right? We've seen that a bunch of times. And anything else you'd like to add, or do you want to bring up that other article from previous that LATAM incident?
Yeah, let's talk about LATAM. Actually, I think that's a really important segue into why this theory probably went viral in the first place. We're in a very significant wave of anti-Boeing sentiment in kind of popular culture. Which is unfortunate. I've flown a lot of Boeing airplanes. I've had no problems whatsoever, ever, on any of them. Like no problems. Not so much as having to pull a checklist out and run a malfunction at all. And I've got a lot of time flying those airplanes. So I think Boeing's great. I'm happy to fly on them. I look forward to flying another Boeing at another point in my career after I finish my time on the Airbus. But there was a LATAM flight in 2024, Christian.
Yeah, it was about a year and a couple months before the incident in Chile, in India. It was in Chile that this happened. So it says a Chilean report into a LATAM Airlines flight plunges, here's a plunge again, finds involuntary movement forward from the pilot's seat. This is April of 24, and then Air India happens in June of 2025. So just over a year before. It says a prelim report from Chile's Aviation Authority on the LATAM airplane that plunged midair. So why do we keep finding these plunges and plummets? Plunge and plummets midair March 11th says that the captain's seat experienced an involuntary movement forward mid-flight. So likely the culprit of this whole conspiracy theory that this causes the Air India accident, especially with all of this Boeing sentiment that's happening. Everybody's looking through this with like a fine microscope, right? They're looking for any single possible, cause of an accident or an incident.
Yeah, it's natural to want to assign blame. And this LATAM flight, I believe they were flying out of New Zealand. It was kind of an interesting route that they were flying. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know they were oceanic at the time. And they were at cruise. And my understanding, and granted, I'm not looking at it right in front of me right now. I probably should be. But I think the flight attendant had come up with the meals, which is very normal. We do this on most flights. And on the 787, there's a switch on the back of the seat that you can push to move those pilot seats all the way forward. The reason that we do that is after each flight, in order for us to facilitate the next crew coming onto the airplane, we move those seats all the way forward. It's just kind of a courtesy thing because it's easier to then put your flight bag in, get your suitcase stowed. It just gives you more room in the flight deck to maneuver so that you can actually do your setup without having this big, massive chair in the way. So my understanding is that switch was accidentally bumped and it moved the captain forward, and the captain bumped into the controls, and then that caused a pitch down, and they did a descent uncleared to do so. Again, don't remember off the top of my head how steep that descent was, how much altitude they ended up losing, but there was uproar over that. And at the time there was all of these theories about the 787 and these massive problems, and everyone's looking back at the MAX accidents of 2018 and 2019 and saying, what's wrong with the software? There were all these, all 5 displays went dark. I mean, the theories were just crazy online, which again, Christian, is why we don't get in there and say anything about this, because we don't know. We weren't up there. I never would have guessed that it was a switch being bumped and the flight attendant bumping into the controls, but it makes perfect sense. It's like, okay, there's a relatively innocent explanation to this, and they returned a normal cruise flight and flew the airplane. So that to me is where humans being humans trying to connect the dots to be like, okay, this is what's happening, this is the problem, and everybody wants the answer right now. And so really interesting to bring that up on the backside is speculation is not only a problem, but also these inflammatory remarks, and aviation is just such a huge victim of this. Because it's so hard to understand, and because it's not easy to gain the context into these things. And as I already talked about, numbers and information without context are effectively meaningless.
Right. Yeah, I think that probably wraps up our specific articles and the particular ones we wanted to talk about. The other one that I think it would be fun to look at and work through, just quickly and briefly here, then we can wrap up this episode. I think there's a lot of media focus on older fleets and older aircraft as well. That tends to make a lot of headlines. A couple that we had looked at was aging fleet causes blank, and I think that's one thing we should also debunk and dispel on this episode, and then in the future we can talk. It'd actually be interesting for us to dive into an episode of the, all the various inspections, try not to make it too technical, but the various inspections and the rigorous, directives and airworthiness compliance we have to go through with all airplanes, and especially in the airline world, just because I think people don't quite understand that airplanes aren't gauged by their birth date. They're gauged by their, fit for service. And that happens on very regimented and predictable inspections. So, I fly recreationally an aircraft that as 1946 year, the airplane taken off right by the airport on a break from flying. But I fly an airplane recreationally. It's from 1946, right? It's 80 years old, and it flies just like the day it started. It's in great shape. It's fun to fly. I never think twice about it because all I look at is the inspection. So there's a lot of, critiques and criticism of, this is an old aging fleet. But, that's very commonplace for someone like a professional pilot or a recreational pilot.
Totally. Yeah. The aging fleet is an interesting question. I actually feel that question a lot. Hey, my airplane's 22 years old. What does that mean? And so the checks that they do in what we call heavy aircraft maintenance, where they're really opening the airplane up, is all based on age of the aircraft. So like a newer aircraft may go in for a category D check, which is the largest one, something like every 8 to 12 years. It just all depends. But a older aircraft, like a Boeing 757, may go in for a category D check at a much lower year, gap. A much more frequent cadence is the term that I'm looking for there. And so they're checking these things a lot more religiously. But here's the other thing too, is we're changing engines out on these things all the time. We're tracking unbelievable amounts of data on the health of these aircraft. If you're pulling up information on the ground while an aircraft is in flight, you can see its engine oil consumption, its engine temperatures, all of these different things. And so they're able to identify these trends really, really early to actually make decisions on what they want to do and ensure that the maintenance of these aircraft are just absolutely top tier. Like I said, I actually said that I've never run a checklist on a issue with a Boeing aircraft, which is kind of not necessarily true, but there actually wasn't a checklist for this issue. But we one time just had we had our engine oil quantity go down to a low number. There was no checklist for that, but we called our maintenance team and I said, "Hey, what do you guys see?" And they said, "Oh yeah, everything's operating normally. You're good. Just keep going." I'm like, "Okay, what if it goes down to 0?" I'm like, "Yeah, you're fine. Just keep going." All right. I mean, it was incredible. Cool. And so, yeah, then when we land, they'll go check it out and say, okay, is this a sensor issue? What's going on here? But every other indication was normal. We saw it in the flight deck. They saw it on the ground. And so they were able to tell us, yeah, just keep on going. It's a non-issue. So the amount of supervision that goes into these airplanes is just incredible. So the older the aircraft, maybe it doesn't have the newest interior, but airlines nowadays, because it's such a competitive environment, are upgrading interiors like crazy. I mean, they're putting Starlink in airplanes, which is incredible. If you haven't experienced that yet, you can stream videos. It's like being at home on your Wi-Fi. It's literally amazing. So they're constantly making these updates. So even though you're getting on an older aircraft airframe wise, it may have the newer interior, the newer lighting, things like that, kind of calm the senses a little bit. So yeah, I love flying the newer airplanes because when you go out and walk around them, like there's no brake dust all over things. And you can just tell like, oh, this thing just came out of the factory and they're beautiful. So yeah, it's always fun to have the new car, but the old car works great. The 1990 Accord with 200,000 miles, that thing's got another 200,000 miles on it. So, right. These airplanes just run incredibly well because of the maintenance teams and because of the oversight that they have on ensuring they're just at top quality of health.
Absolutely. Well, I think we did an awesome job looking through some of these specific articles, but let's close on just some ways that nervous flyers can stay out of that fear spiral. They can stay away from this doom and gloom out of the media because they're not going to stop. Let's be very clear. They're going to continue to look at aviation under a microscope because it drives a lot of clicks. And unfortunately, this industry is going to continue to be a victim until, maybe the space industry starts to catch a little more attention like we were talking about earlier. But no, it's going to be a routine that will not stop anytime soon, which is let's squawk on the flying people. So how can some nervous flyers stay out of that spiral, right? Some of my initial thoughts are things like, media companies don't care about your mental health. They care about clicks and revenue and ad generation. They need you on their pages to make more money. And so they're going to use crazy verbs like plunge and plummet and chaos and people write their will on this flight and just insane things that just outright don't end up becoming true if you know some of that technical context that we've been talking about during the episode today. So, control and limit some of that intake. And when you see things like that, think about, how some of that verb choice was meant to get you to click on that article and not really think about things technically and soundly like we would encourage you to do, right?
Yeah. Reduce the punch of all these verbs and words by, 80%. And then look at it through the lens of like, okay, if I change the word plunges to descends, does that reduce this? Or just don't look at it because the design is not to give you any specific information. It's designed to keep you hooked. And I won't double down on what Christian just said, but the purpose of that article is not to give you any information. It's certainly not to make you feel good. So understanding that is the intent of things like that is really important. And just knowing aviation is incredibly safe. And there's one thing that I will say on this, because I don't want to say that all media is bad media, because when 100% safety is required, scrutiny is guaranteed. And so I encourage scrutiny to happen, right? That's how we catch things that are super important.
Sure.
And so understanding though that scrutiny comes from really important places like safety management systems that are put in at different airlines, FAA oversight, which we did see in DCA was not as appreciable as it should have been, but elsewhere is, and things like that are to me what really focuses on scrutinizing and ensuring that aviation safety continues to move forward. The NTSB is an amazing resource for this, that, ensuring that we're always making sure that we're moving the needle forward as far as enhancing safety to an even higher level. So that's my take on those things. Reading information from reputable sources. I think Simple Flying is a great publication. Christian, I don't know if you read anything from them, but every time I go on, like I learn so much from them, because I think they are technical in nature, but not overly technical. Like I really can understand the background of the reason that they're writing an article. So I really, really like that publication. There's some YouTubers out there. Blanco Lirio, a gentleman named Juan Brown. He is phenomenal. He breaks everything down in a very logical, non-speculative, fact-based manner. And he's very matter of fact about his reporting. He lives actually just north of me. I've had the pleasure of hanging out with Juan a couple times, but
Nice.
Having folks like that in your corner that are who you rely on, to me is absolutely the best way to handle things like this if you choose to consume content like that. The other way is just avoid it and, understand aviation and listen to the good things and all of those things, and trust that all of this is out of your control anyways. And the people who are in control of it are working diligently to ensure 100% margins of safety at all times. I mean, that is a fact that I will stand on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some other thoughts. If you stumble across it, we've talked a lot about it today, but understand the differences in timelines, right? The media has a timeline vastly different than what the aviation space has. Like Kyle, you were saying, translate some of those scary words, like work on some of that verb management. Instead of, like we talked about earlier, plunge, think about controlled descent, right? Or maybe a rapid descent. Even just putting in rapid descent makes it sound better than plunging and plummeting. Separate some of those feelings from physics and what's actually occurring, right? Remember, anyone that comes off an airplane incident or accident is going to be in that fight or flight amygdala flare, as opposed to operating out of their logical forward part of their brain. So thinking about that, and you brought up earlier too, like just limit the intake. And I think, zoom out and see that big picture. It's, aviation is the safest mode of transportation that we have ever created. Don't forget that. And it's viewed under a microscope when things do, because it is so rare that we have incidents like that occurred in DC in 25, that it just drives so many headlines. And they know that they have minutes to capture your attention and you're going to be on to the next thing. So especially after incidents and accidents, this stuff gets very doom, gloom heavy for a very concentrated time. So just be cautious of that and focus on, what the industry has really worked so hard to achieve for a safety record and training and all those things. So, I'll close on things like, if I as a pilot were to operate my professional career out of what I read in the headlines, I wouldn't go to work. I wouldn't do my job, right? Like if I walked into, to a career fair as a high schooler and saw the headlines all over the walls of plunges and chaos and writing wills, I'd have been like, yeah, man, I'm going to go to business school or something like that. Like, I'm not going to do this job. And in reality, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like aviation's worked so hard to remain safe and to keep that top safety spot. And, it's not nearly as bad as the media makes it sound. So, this one's, like I said earlier, near and dear to my heart. It's something I very much so appreciate that Dial-Up Pilot and the community is working on, trying to flip a narrative. It's an uphill battle, certainly, as you look at major media. One of our next episodes, I can't wait for. I'm very excited. We're going to bring on a media professional who has an aviation background and kind of get their perspective on this. So I'm excited to bring Lindsay on and talk to her. But yeah, I think that's about all we had for the episode today, and all of our kind of technical debrief on clickbait and sensationalized headlines. So, Kyle, anything else you'd like to add for the day today, or are we good here?
That's all I've got. Let's shut it down.
Shut it down.